afternoon, the estimates for the Department of Forestry, Lands and Wildlife will be under discussion. Last Friday, the Minister of Labour introduced two new important bills, Bill 21, the Employment Standards Code, and also Bill 22, the Labour Relations Code. The latter is a revision of the Bill 60, which was introduced last year and allowed to fail on the order paper. Let us pray. O Lord, grant us the daily awareness of the precious gift of life which you have given us. As members of this Legislative Assembly, we dedicate our lives anew to the service of our province and our country. Amen.
Introduction of visitors. Presenting petitions. Reading and receiving petitions. Presenting reports by standing and special committees.
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to Standing Order 93, I have taken under consideration the petitions for private bills which have been received by the Assembly and wish to report that all those petitions have complied with Standing Orders 86 and 89 with the exception of the petition of Laverne Erickson, Terence Schlinker, Wesley Wickerink, Douglas Madge, Gordon Cousins, and Raymond Schultz for the Rosebud School of the Arts Act, the petition of the City of Edmonton for the petition of the City of Edmonton for the Jewish Community Centre of Edmonton and St. John's Institute Repeal Act, the petition of Alistair McIntosh for the Leslie Roy Peck Adoption Act, the petition of Victor Peter Hetzmanuk and Nestor Zenon Papish for the St. Vladimir's Ukrainian Orthodox Congregation at Calgary Tax Exemption Act.
Notices of motions.
Member for Edmonton Belmont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to give oral notice of my intention following the completion of routine orders to seek the unanimous consent of the Assembly under Standing Order 40 to move a motion marking Education Week in Alberta. I have copies of that motion here for all members.
Introduction of bills.
Member for Vermilion Viking.
Mr. Speaker, I request leave to introduce Bill number 18, a bill relating to the Animal Protection Act. This bill updates and redefines distress as it relates to animals, as well as updating the offenses and penalties in reference to cruelty to animals.
The honourable member for Vermilion Viking has moved first reading of Bill 18, Animal Protection Act. Those in favour of first reading, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, please say no. So ordered.
Bill number 18, Animal Protection Act, introduced by the honourable member Dr. West, is now read a first time.
Member for Calgary McCall, followed by Edmonton Mill Woods.
Mr. Speaker, I request leave to introduce Bill PR4, Warren S. Forest Bar Admission Act. The purpose of the bill is to permit bar admission of a student at law who is not yet a Canadian citizen.
The honourable member for Calgary McCall has moved first reading of Bill PR4, Warren S. Forest Bar Admission Act. Those in favour of first reading, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, please say no. Carried.
Bill number PR4, Warren S. Forest Bar Admission Act, introduced by the honourable member Mr. Nelson, is now read a first time.
Member for Edmonton Mill Woods.
Mr. Speaker, I request leave to introduce Bill PR5, the Patricia Alejandro and Marcelo Becerra Adoption Act, The purpose of this act is to provide for the adoption of adult children.
The honourable member for Edmonton Mill Woods has moved for first reading Bill number PR5, Patricia, Alejandra and Marcelo Becerra Adoption Act. Those in favor of first reading, please say aye. Opposed, please say no. Carried.
Bill number PR5, Patricia, Alejandra, and Marcelo Becerra Adoption Act, introduced by the honourable member Mr. Gibault, is now read a first time.
Member for Lethbridge West, followed by Calgary North Hill.
Mr. Speaker, I request leave to introduce Bill PR1, the Royal Canadian Legion Alberta Property Act. The purpose of the bill, Mr. Speaker, is to consolidate previous legislation and to clarify the property holding powers of the Legion and its branches.
The honourable member for Lethbridge West has moved first reading of Bill number PR1, Royal Canadian Legion Alberta Property Act. Those in favour of first reading, please say aye. Opposed, please say no. So ordered.
Bill number PR1, Royal Canadian Legion Alberta Property Act, introduced by the honourable member Mr. Gogo, is now read a first time.
Member for Calgary North Hill.
Mr. Speaker, I request leave to introduce Bill PR2, Canada Olympic Park Transfer of Title Act. The purpose of the bill is to provide for the use and ownership of lands of Canada Olympic Park.
The honourable member for Calgary North Hill has moved first reading of Bill PR2, Canada Olympic Park Transfer of Title Act. Those in favour of first reading, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, please say no. So ordered.
Bill number PR2, Canada Olympic Park Transfer of Title Act, introduced by the honourable member Mr. Stewart, is now read a first time.
For Innisfail.
Mr. Speaker, I request leave to introduce Bill PR3, the Paul Mark and Cheryl Lynn Mary Ibbotson Adoption Act. The purpose of the bill is to provide for the adoption of two adults.
The honourable member for Innisfail has moved first reading of Bill number PR3, Paul Mark and Cheryl Lynn Mary Ibbotson Adoption Act. Those in favour of first reading, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, please say no. Carried.
Bill number PR3, Paul Mark and Cheryl Lynn Mary Ibbotson Adoption Act, introduced by the honourable member Mr. Pengali, is now read a first time.
Mr. Speaker, I move that Bill number 18, the Animal Protection Act, be placed on the orders of the day under Government Bills and Orders for second reading.
Having heard the motion by the Government House Leader, those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, please say no. Carried.
Tabling returns and reports.
Minister of Career Development and Employment.
Mr. Speaker, I'm honored today to table the annual report for the year ending March 31st, 1987 for the Department of Alberta Career Development and Employment.
Introduction of special guests.
Member for Edmonton Belmont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today it's my pleasure to introduce to you and through you to all members of the Assembly some 17 grade 5 and 6 students from the Princeton Elementary School located in the great constituency of Edmonton Belmont. They're seated in the public gallery. They're accompanied by their teacher, Don Gake. I would ask that they rise and receive the traditional warm welcome of the Assembly.
Edmonton Mill Woods.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to introduce to you and the other members of the Assembly this afternoon some 51 students from the grade 6 classes at Wineloss School in the constituency of Edmonton Mill Woods. They're accompanied today by their teachers, Mr. Sharples and Mr. Fu, as well as parents, Mrs. Turan, Mrs. Shaw, and Mrs. Abram. I had a chance to visit with the students earlier, Mr. Speaker, and have a mock debate over the merits of introducing a new tax on chocolate bars. And they're here today to observe the real debate live. I'd ask them to stand now and receive the very warm welcome of the House.
Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of my colleague, the Honourable Neil Crawford, I am pleased to introduce today a group of 57 students from the Avalon Junior High School, grade 8, who with their teachers, Mr. Mark Babin and Mrs. Heather Plaisier, are in the members' gallery. I would ask that they rise and receive the cordial and warm welcome of the Assembly.
Ministerial statements. National Health.
Mr. Speaker, this is National Volunteer Week in Canada and throughout Alberta, and it's a pleasure for me to be able to recognize here in the legislature the commitment of hundreds of thousands of Alberta volunteers and the contribution they make to communities across our province. During the past 2 years, Mr. Speaker, I've had occasion to meet with and speak to hundreds of volunteers who have been working towards goals that are important to all of us. Goals like bringing health to our communities, promoting healthy lifestyles, and working for the prevention of illness and accidents. In general, Mr. Speaker, making life better for all Albertans, young and old. These volunteers play a crucial role in caring for our fellow citizens. Mr. Speaker, I met this morning with the people in the Calgary Meals on Wheels and here in Edmonton with Operation Friendship. Operation Friendship's Helping Hands program provides assistance to dozens of individuals like a Mr. Sam Jones, gentleman in his 90s and living in Pioneer Place. The Helping Hands volunteers assist Sam with his grocery shopping, and they help him get exercise by getting him outdoors as often as possible and accompanying him in his personal errands. They assist Sam in a meaningful way to maintain his health and stay as proudly independent as he can. There are other volunteers, Mr. Speaker, throughout our province, throughout cities, towns, and villages around Alberta. I think of members of the Keep in Touch Society in Lethbridge who make daily phone calls to elderly and disabled members of the community. And who can forget, Mr. Speaker, the success achieved by over 12,000 Olympic volunteers who staged the best ever Olympic Winter Games in Calgary in February. They represented communities around Alberta and throughout Canada. These are but a few examples, Mr. Speaker, but I ask for the support of all honourable members to recognize and appreciate the hard work, commitment, and compassion, and the generous spirit of our province's volunteers during this National Volunteer Week.
Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, of course, all of us on both sides of the House would certainly recognize and appreciate, as the Minister says, the hard work, commitment, compassion, and the generous spirit of our province's volunteers during the National Volunteer Week. Mr. Speaker, and of course, all of us on both sides of the House recognize that's a very important role that volunteers in our province play. But I want to say to this government, Mr. Speaker, we may be stretching the limits of volunteerism if we look at the recent social policy document that was brought in. Volunteers want to do something positive. They want to add, Mr. Speaker, to the society. They want to add something. They do not want to be involved, if you talk to the volunteers, because of government neglect or lack of government policy and cutbacks and such things such as food banks. So, Mr. Speaker, I would hope that this government, instead of necessarily praising, allow volunteers to do the things that they want to do, but let's not make volunteers have to cover the things that aren't done by government. And I think the food bank is a very good example of this, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question period.
Mr. Speaker, to the Minister of Labour. Now, Mr. Speaker, it may come as a surprise to this government, seems to anyhow, that there are people working very hard for poverty-level wages in this province. And, Mr. Speaker, frankly, they have to look to the provincial government to provide decent employment standards. Mr. Speaker, if I may say so, Bill 21, the Employment Standards Code, I didn't think it's possible, but it's going to make it worse for average people, Mr. Speaker. But one specifically, there's nothing about an increase in the minimum wage, which is the lowest in the country. My question to the Minister, will the Minister explain why the government again failed to move and bring in a decent minimum wage instead of what we have now, the lowest in the country?
Mr. Speaker, I anticipate it will take some time for the legislation that I tabled in the House on Friday to be proclaimed as the law, because the regulations will be required to be changed in the meantime. I do not anticipate waiting that length of time before announcing changes to the minimum wage.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we've been hearing this. The last time there was an increase was in 1981, Mr. Speaker. And my question is, why is it that this government can move so quickly to give money to Peter Pocklington, but something like a minimum wage, you've got to study it and study it? Will the minister tell us when he plans to bring these regulations in and to what level they're looking at, Mr. Speaker?
No, I'm not prepared to tell the Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition when I will make the announcement. All I can do is assure him that it will be made, and it will be made in adequate time to give employers time to adjust to the change.
Mr. Speaker, what about the working poor? That's who we're concerned about in times to adjust. But, Mr. Speaker, to go on into Bill 21, and we look at Mr. Speaker, the minister's globe-trotting task force, $500,000. But they did do one good thing, Mr. Speaker. In the recommendation, they recommended that part-time workers be granted prorated employment benefits. This is one of the few good suggestions. Mr. Speaker, they removed it. They removed it, Mr. Speaker. My question is, will the minister advise why he allowed this to happen? Why is this not part-time workers, pro-ration, that sort of thing? Why did they move that away, Mr. Speaker?
First of all, Mr. Speaker, the comment about the working poor, I should remind the honourable member that all statistics indicate that there is a very small number of people working at the minimum wage in this province. The minimum wage itself is not supposed to represent people's needs, but what the work is worth. In relation to Bills 21 and 22, I would suggest the Honourable Leader waits until the debate on the bills.
Mr. Speaker, we've got a growing number of part-time employees because of this government policy. Now the government has wiped away the one good recommendation they have. And my question is, rather than wait for the bill, will the minister tell the growing number of part-time workers, 77% of them are women, why this government abandoned them?
Mr. Speaker, once the honourable member sees the regulations which will follow the statute, I think he will see that this government is just as interested in any particular group as his party may allegedly be. And indeed, it showed in the recently implemented changes to the Private Pensions Act, where indeed part-time workers have to be given equivalent consideration to full-time workers. That type of approach is the approach of this government, although his party may tend to represent only one interest in the total population.
Supplementary, Westlock Sturgeon.
Mr. Speaker, further to the Employment Practices Act, to the minister, could he inform the House just why, in view of the fact that the other paper out that the associate or the deputy premier come out called Caring and Responsibility mentioned family life, could he mention why there is not an equivalent amount of maternity leave for those that are adopting parents in this act too?
Mr. Speaker, without getting into a biological discussion as a physician, adoptive parents do not go through the potential complications of the antenatal period that natural mothers do.
Second main question, Leader of the Opposition.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to designate my second question to the member from St. Albert.
Yeah, you better start worrying. Mr. Speaker, my questions today are to the Minister of Labour as well. Mr. Speaker, 2 short years ago, 10,000 Albertans gathered on the steps of this legislature in the interests of fairness and equity in labour legislation. And when they saw this minister jump on board the jet to make his world tour, they expected some fairness and equity. But, Mr. Speaker, what do we have? Again, we have the illusion of fairness, the illusion of equity, but nothing being done for working Albertans. Mr. Speaker, my question to the minister is this, how does this minister expect his new labour code will reduce labour strife in the province of Alberta when he still maintains the protection of the 25-hour lockout, under the terms of the new labour legislation.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member is inaccurate in his numbers as usual. He has said that we spent millions, and he knows that is wrong. He has just said 10,000. He knows that number is wrong. The situation is that we've had a very thorough review of labour legislation, something that has not been done in this province to that extent before, nor indeed elsewhere in Canada. The judgment as to whether fairness or equity is present is, of course, one that different people will make. That process will occur during debate.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like this minister to go out and talk to some working Albertans to find out just how fair this government is when it comes to decent labour legislation in the province of Alberta. But supplementary to the minister, Mr. Speaker, how does this minister expect that we are going to create fairness and equity in labour legislation in Alberta when he continues to protect the employers by allowing the use of replacement workers in the province of Alberta?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman is indulging in debate upon the legislation. There is a proper place for that at second reading and in committee.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not getting into debate. I'm asking the minister why he didn't protect working Albertans in his new labour code. And certainly that isn't debate. These things have been around for a long time. But supplementary to the minister, Mr. Speaker.
Was the question, honourable member, or where are we getting to?
Can this minister justify the position that he took in regards to not strengthening the spin-off legislation in his new labour code?
Mr. Speaker, obviously the member hasn't realised that the legislation that was introduced in Bill 22 in relation to spin-offs applies to the manufacturing sector, where the plant, the equipment, the employer and the employees are at one fixed location. The provisions for the construction industry, which is his primary concern, I understand, will be following, and they may well be different for spin-offs, but I'm not going to anticipate that legislation.
Again, Mr. Speaker, it's all illusion. There's no reality. There's no action. Mr. Speaker, who told this minister that by eliminating the right of Albertans, ordinary Albertans, to express their opinions on picket lines, who told him that it was a good idea to deny Albertans the right to expression, the freedom of association, in joining on a picket line that they agree with? Who told you that? Peter Pocklington? It only cost you $160.
Order.
Mr. Speaker, in the last several minutes we have heard from the honourable member from St Albert a litany of what he is concerned about. The honourable gentleman and the party he belongs to are obviously interested in failure in relations between employees and employers. This government and Bill 21 and Bill 22 are aimed at successful relationships between Albertans. We are not interested in his continual...
Excuse me, Honourable Minister may continue in a moment. Minister of Labour.
We are not interested in his continual stream of invective, neither are the most of Albertans. In the legislation that was introduced, there is the concept of fairness and equity for all Albertans, employees and employers, unionised and not. The legislation is aimed at the individual employee and the individual employer. It is not aimed at the narrow interests of a small number of employers and a small number of union executives.
Chair recognizes Red Deer South, followed by Westlock Sturgeon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To the Minister of Labour. Mr. Speaker, to the Minister of Labour, while the leader of the NDPs and the member for St. Albert were busy out getting their marching orders from Dave Werlin. Could the Minister of Labour please advise the Assembly how many public submissions he received and how many meetings he was able to attend prior to bringing forward the legislation in Bill 21 and 22?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member brings up an interesting point. Through this 21-month process that I have been involved in on behalf of the people of Alberta, I have had over 600 briefs presented, all of which have been read thoroughly, all of which have been considered. Prior to Bill 60, I had at least 300 meetings with individual Albertans and with groups representing unorganised labour, organised labour and employers of all sizes and associations. And since last June, I have had a further 200 and more meetings with people of that nature. That is a consultative process that has not been equalled in this province, and I am sure that the members of the NDP would never start it.
Is this a supplementary or the main question, Leader of the Liberals? Thank you.
If I may, it's also to the Minister of Labour. Could he inform the House for his reasoning behind the inequitable and unfair and rather antediluvian practice of continuing to forbid the nurses the right to strike?
Mr. Speaker, when the honourable gentleman speaks of antediluvian, he obviously should look in the mirror. Albertans went through 3 successive strikes in the hospital field in the late 70s and early 80s, and those who have a memory remember the response of Albertans. They did not appreciate having the hospital system shut down, and it was for that reason that the introduction of no strike in the hospital sector was introduced. That concept is continued in Bill 22. It is continued in a fair and equitable way.
Westlock Sturgeon, main question.
Speakers, the main question is to the Minister of Municipal Affairs, which I'd like to thank before I ask the question, Mr. Speaker, for sending me a copy of the Municipal Liability Insurance Report. Now, Mr. Speaker, local governments, if local governments are going to provide the type of liability insurance and access to insurance that is reasonable, they need it at reasonable costs. And one of the options in the report, Mr. Speaker, was outlined was that possibly there be a certain amount of aid from the provincial government. Now, my question, Mr. Speaker, is that local governments have been calling for action on this matter for some time. When can they expect some action from the government with respect to liability insurance?
Mr. Speaker, as the honourable member properly indicates, there is a problem with respect to the cost of insurance to municipalities and school boards in the province. We undertook at the first meeting of the Premier's Municipal Provincial Council, which met in January and had representatives from each of the municipal associations, to in fact make that decision by September of this year. We committed to that with the municipalities and discussed it thoroughly with them. We intend to keep that time frame.
Mr. Speaker, the second question then is to the Minister. Is this government willing to provide financial guarantees to ensure that availability of insurance pools for our local government can continue?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member will have to await the announcement in that regard once we've gone through the process that I've outlined for him in the answer to the first question.
Mr. Speaker, aside from that then to the Minister, is the Minister, because the report did not cover it, but it is of active note in other areas, is the Minister going to look into the availability of pollution and environmental insurance in reference to the liability factor?
Environmental insurance is one consideration of the package with respect to those items not currently covered by insuring agencies to municipalities. So yes, we will be considering that as part of the package and making the decision on that with all of the other program as outlined.
Final supplementary, Mr. Speaker, to the Minister. the report covers how to finance liability, and I understand you can come in and report on liability. But has the minister considered the possibility of price fixing or collusion amongst the liability companies offering liability insurance?
Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure if I fully understood the member's question. If he's speaking to collusion between insuring agencies, at this point, the insuring agencies are funded, of course, from international agencies in many situations, sometimes national agencies. We know that international events have impact on the insurance rates that take place here, and that's one of the difficulties that municipalities are facing. It's indeed one of the problems which municipalities have in the rapidly expanding insurance costs. I may add that school boards have similar difficulties.
Overbar, followed by Stetler.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister, in looking at some of the alternatives in light of the fact that the premiums are escalating rather rapidly, has the Minister and the members of the municipalities looked at self-insuring in light of the fact that there are many different levels of government and the possibility could be there for self-insurance?
Mr. Speaker, I perhaps should have made that clear at the beginning. The report, in fact, suggests self-insurance with participation from the province in terms of guaranteeing the initial pool so that municipalities could, in fact, insure themselves collectively after a period of time. So, yes, the proposal is to have municipalities insure themselves, and they, in fact, do that to some degree now. But it would require some assistance, at least according to the report, from the provincial government to get it started.
Stetler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the minister assure the House that in any program of possible self-insurance or any provincial participation in municipal insurance that the program will be designed to be actuarially sound?
Mr. Speaker, I can say that the province has no interest in being involved with any project which would see a distortion over the long run either of interest rates or of services to municipalities. We are exploring fully with the municipalities all of the options that are there, and we do intend that any solution which might be proposed, which we would participate in, would be sound from all points of view.
Member for Clover Bar on behalf of the Representative Caucus, followed by Tabor Warner, Edmonton Strathcona, Edmonton Goldbar.
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Minister of Energy, several weeks ago I asked the question about what progress was being made on the upgrader in Lloydminster. Last weekend, apparently, there was an important meeting held in Regina. Can the Minister indicate if there has been any further progress made at this time between the federal, provincial, and the two provincial governments to try and move ahead the proposed upgrader in Lloydminster?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the three levels of government, or the three governments rather, not the three levels, two levels and three governments, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and the federal government, met with Husky a week ago Friday for a good many hours, and we modified the framework that had been initiated in Lloydminster several weeks before. And we are now at a point where we essentially have a framework in place that the governments and Husky generally agree to. However, that agreement calls for the participation of private sector equity in addition to equity from Husky. And we will not have an agreement until we get that equity from other private sector partners.
Mr. Speaker, to the Minister, in light of the fact that these projects do take some lead time, are we going to have to wait for an announcement of the date of the impending federal election, or are we going to have an announcement before that glorious event takes place?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I can't speak for the federal government about pending elections, the honourable member knows. But certainly it's our desire to see this project proceed as quickly as possible. And I don't anticipate it should take very long for Husky to approach the private sector and determine whether or not there will be companies out there that would be prepared to invest.
Mr. Speaker, to the Minister, can the Minister indicate what effect the lack of the upgraders had on the heavy sands or the heavy bitumen deposits in the Elk Point area? Has that meant that that project has had to go on a go-slow basis, or is it still moving ahead?
Mr. Speaker, there has not been any hold-up of work in the in situ projects because of the delay in the upgrader at Lloydminster. In fact, there has been, as I indicated in my estimates the other night, over $1 billion worth of new announcements with respect to in situ and oil sands projects. And those projects are going ahead, and we are working with other companies with respect to other proposals for developments in the in situ area as well. We want to see both in situ work proceed as well as upgrading occur here in the province.
Supplementary, member for Edmonton Norwood, followed by Calgary Buffalo.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, the Minister mentioned equity involvement from other private sector people besides Husky. Could the Minister update us on what our involvement is going to be as a stimulus? Are we looking at equity involvement from the provincial government?
Mr. Speaker, the framework that's been put in place and has been indicated publicly that government's involvement primarily would be based upon covering the debt side of the project, and it's our desire to see Husky go out and find other partners to provide the 50% equity that's required for the project to go ahead.
Calgary Buffalo.
Thank you. If the government is in there and participating in respect of guaranteeing the debt, I wonder whether the minister can in turn guarantee that the people of this province will get a piece of the action for any assistance we give and not just get left holding the risk without any benefit, as in so many other projects with which this government is involved.
Well, I was in basic agreement with the honourable member up to the last point that he made, which is obviously wrong. In the projects that we have been involved in the past, and a good example is Syncrude, where the benefits to this province have been substantial. In fact, over $1 billion worth of royalties from that project since the project began, as well as many other projects that I can point to. Certainly, when we are involved in working with the private sector to see heavy oil development and in situ development proceed in this province, we as a government are prepared to accept some of the downside risk, but at the same time, we want to accept and be involved in the upside gain when prices increase. So we are making sure that in any of these agreements, we are getting the benefits of higher prices down the road.
Member for Taber-Warner, followed by Edmonton Strathcona.
Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Agriculture. Recently, the Canadian Grains Commission announced its producer car policy for the 1988-89 crop year. The essential feature of this policy is the mandatory ship-to-sales program. Would the Minister advise the Assembly of the Alberta government's position on this new and more restrictive producer car policy?
Mr. Speaker, we are concerned that the new policy will adversely affect the grain producers within the province and have made that feeling known to both the Minister responsible and the Canadian Grains Commission.
To the Minister, would the Minister indicate to the Assembly the kinds of things the Alberta government is looking for in a producer car policy?
Mr. Speaker, with your indulgence, I'll quickly go through the 5 items that we had indicated we felt essential in a grains policy. Number 1 being that we should protect and preserve the right for producers to have access to producer cars. We should secondly do everything we can to reduce the constraints that are presently evident as it relates to the usage of producer cars. Number 3, we should improve the level of price efficiency in the marketplace. Number 4, we should do everything within our power to minimize congestion in our handling system. And finally, Mr. Speaker, we should maintain or increase the level of competition in the marketplace itself.
Final supplementary, Mr. Speaker. Would the minister indicate what specific steps he is taking to achieve the Alberta government's policy goals regarding producer cars?
Mr. Speaker, we have taken a threefold process as it relates to indicating our deep concern. One is I have had personal discussions with the minister responsible, again, the Honourable Charlie Mayer. We have outlined by way of a letter just what I've indicated to the Honourable Member for Tabor-Warner. And thirdly, our officials on an ongoing basis have been in contact with the Canadian Grain Commission indicating our deep concern.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate this is a difficult area to deal with, but I'm wondering if the minister lists as one of his concerns trying to remove congestion in the transportation system, how that could possibly be consistent with his desire that there be greater use of producer cars, more unsold, uncommitted grain clogging the ports and rail lines in Vancouver.
Mr. Speaker, we don't view them as being contradictory whatsoever. Unlike the Honourable Member, we feel that the producer should have greater access to all avenues whereby his income can be increased. We feel in the event that there had been greater consultation prior to this policy being implemented, we could have alleviated a number of concerns that presently do exist with our producers as it relates to the usage of producer cars.
Member for West Loch Sturgeon.
Mr. Speaker, I'm concerned about the minister's clout because there may be an election coming up this summer or fall. Did he get a commitment from the Honourable Charlie Mayer as to what he will give an answer to his request?
Mr. Speaker, I have not to date received a response to the letter that I have written to the minister.
Minister of Agriculture.
Mr. Speaker, I have not to date received an answer to the letter that I have written to the federal minister responsible for this, as it was only some few weeks ago that I had corresponded to the federal minister. But when I do, I'm more than happy to have further discussions with the Honourable Member for West Loch Sturgeon.
Edmonton Strathcona, Edmonton Gold Bar, Dunvegan, Calgary Forest Lawn, Vermilion Viking.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Premier or the Treasurer and concerns government policy concerning code and principle. Now that the government's own documents are public, Mr. Speaker, that show that by 1984 the government was fully aware that First Investors Corporation and Associated Investors Corporation had grossly impaired capital, completely unacceptable accounting practices, and a sales pitch based on a deception suggested by the government's own official, yet took 3 years to lift the licenses, does it still remain the policy of the government to wait until the code inquiry has run its course before making any acknowledgement of blame?
Mr. Speaker, implicit in the member's question is an assumption about the outcome of the code inquiry, and I think it's inappropriate for me to comment about what conclusion Mr. Code will come to simply because it is clearly in the sub judice rule.
You've already confessed.
Well, after the code inquiry itself comes a judgment or order by the judge under the Business Corporations Act. I take it then that the government will also wait until that has run its course before considering fessing up.
Again, Mr. Speaker, we would obviously follow the order of Mr. Code or the court, and that would be the obviously the preferred way to move, and in fact the responsible way to move.
Well, in view of the documents that are public and incontrovertible and have nothing to do with the code inquiry, does the government not consider it sound business sense to recompense now those who have suffered from its inaction in exchange for assignments of rights of action from those people in order to recoup in part or even in whole the loss?
Well, Mr. Speaker, suddenly the member from Strathcona has taken over the responsibility of Mr. Code in concluding that the evidence is incontrovertible. That is, in fact, what the public inquiry is about, and that's what is responsibility of Mr. Code. For us to preempt that conclusion, Mr. Speaker, is irresponsible.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. In recent days, we've heard much of Albertans helping Albertans. Is this just brave talk, or does it only apply to important Albertans, or what?
Mr. Speaker, the relevance... The NDP party wants to have it both ways, Mr. Speaker. They want to be seen to be providing some solutions, but after all, they were the ones who, along with the government, encouraged this public inquiry into the whole question of the code.
And what is to be the results of the code will be determined by that, Mr. Speaker. For us to deal with one piece of evidence on a day-to-day basis, which seems to be the cursory way in which the NDP parties handle this issue, is absolutely irresponsible. There is a much larger context. There are thousands of witnesses being called, and there's a vast amount of paper that has to be examined before we can put into context the reasons for the failure of the principal group. Once that is done, Mr. Speaker, this government will respond.
Supplementary question. Calgary Buffalo.
Is the government considering acknowledging financial responsibility and recompensing investors in any way in light of the report that 8 cabinet ministers apparently recognize the failures of the government in licensing these companies to take the life savings of Albertans long after it was obvious to anybody who was looking into this matter carefully that they were bankrupt?
Speaker, I don't know where the member gets his information. I know he has a vast research potential over there, but to suggest that he has access to cabinet conclusions is in fact wrong, and to follow the spurious research of others who suggest that there is some record of the vote in cabinet is absolutely wrong, Mr. Speaker. The government is fully committed to its course of action. They came to a conclusion with respect to how to proceed. We did it, and we put in place a very reasonable process which will fully provide information as to what's going to happen and what were the causes of the problems in principle. That's the way we operate, Mr. Speaker. We don't have to work on any kind of specious information as the member across the way does.
Edmonton Goldbar, followed by Dunvegan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A few minutes ago, Mr. Speaker, my questions are to the Minister of Labour. A few minutes ago, the Minister spoke about his newly introduced legislation as being legislation of fairness and equity for all Albertans. Well, Mr. Speaker, an increasing number of provinces really understand about fairness and equity and are considering, or already have, pay equity legislation. Most recently, the province of Nova Scotia has joined this group, the Conservative province of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister. Will he introduce similar legislation in Alberta this session?
Mr. Speaker, the Minister responsible for women's issues is not in the House today, but the Minister of Consumer and Corporate Affairs and myself have had considerable discussions on the matter of the gap in average incomes between women and men. Those differences occur both on a total basis and on an hourly basis in some occupations. The difficulty is that the simplistic answer addressed by the member for Goldbar is only a partial answer to the total matter. And when this government does do anything about the so-called pay gap, it will be a much more thoroughly thought out answer than the one that the honourable member is suggesting.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it would at least be a start, and that's something we've been waiting for. And if the minister recognizes the gap, then how on earth does he plan to close that gap, which is now a woman can earn on average 61 cents for every dollar earned by a man? How do you plan to close that gap in the meantime without legislation?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member's statistics are wrong for the province of Alberta. The wage gap, as it is described, contains many factors. There are factors in the professions, such as the seniority of the two sexes in the professions. It is only relatively recently that the number of students taking medicine or law or becoming accountants has become equal approximately. There are gradations in the earnings depending upon seniority in the profession. That same principle applies to other occupations. To address it in the manner that's suggested by the honourable member would distort the whole matter of promotions within a job category. There are other items that are involved, such as the volitional decisions of individuals as to what job they wish to get into. There are matters of taking time out of the career for family and other obligations. Those are all individual decisions. What this government is committed to and has worked hard for is for equality of access to education, equality of access to training, equality of access to the job, and equality of access to promotions. That we have done, and there is still a wage gap. Everyone acknowledges the wage gap exists. What we can do to address that wage gap without preventing those individual decisions that I've just mentioned is difficult to come to. And we will arrive at some decisions, and it will be a much more carefully thought out provision than one that addresses approximately 10% of the alleged wage gap.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, clearly, there are many variables in this whole issue. Mr. Speaker, has the minister, for instance, done any studies to determine what support there is for pay equity legislation in the civil service in this province?
Mr. Speaker, within the provincial public service, we have a lot of programs that are addressed to encouraging women to take the necessary training to upgrade their occupation, and we assist them with applications for promotions within the public service. That is all going on at the moment. However, we cannot insist that women apply for the jobs. We have statistics, which I think I made public once before, which relate to the number of applicants at the various levels in the public service, the percentage of those applicants who are women, and the percentage of women who are appointed to those positions. I can get those numbers updated and give them to the honourable member.
Last one. Mr. Speaker, well, it's clear that it's not working, but the old boys club certainly is. Has the minister discussed the need for intervention and legislation in pay equity with business, industry, or labour in the province?
I have had some discussions, and I believe the minister responsible for the Women's Council has also.
Supplementary, Edmonton Avonmore.
Mr. Speaker, to the minister, does he not recognize that in countries where pay equity legislation has been implemented, the wage gap between men and women has been reduced by 2/3, so that women earn nearly 90 cents on the dollar to what men earn?
I have not seen the statistics mentioned by the honourable member, but I am aware of statistics that show that where pay equity has been introduced.
Thank you, honourable member. We'll continue when silence occurs. Thank you.
I have not seen the statistics mentioned by the honourable member, Mr. Speaker, but I have seen statistics that indicate that where pay equity legislation has been introduced, there is still a wage gap, and it is a wage gap of about 30 to 35%.
Member for Red Deer North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Question to the minister, supplementary. Is the minister aware that the green paper on pay equity, which the opposition continues to trot out with the 38% wage factor difference, that green paper itself, is the minister aware, uses figures that are now approximately 10 years old, and indeed it's that paper that says the difference, the 38% difference, only 5% of that in fact is discriminatory.
Okay. Thank you, honourable member. Member for Dunvegan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Agriculture. As many members of the Assembly realize that 50% of the honey production comes from the Peace River country, and also a large percentage of the forage seeds and canola production is in the Peace River country, can the minister indicate to the House whether the federal government has reviewed its decision to close the border for the importation of bees as a result of the potential spread of the Varroa mite?
Mr. Speaker, I believe that officials from the industry met with officials from the federal government in Ottawa on March the 23rd, and it was indicated to them at that time that the border would remain closed for this year, and that they would reassess it for the following years. Let me also indicate to the honourable member that we have had communication from the Alberta Beekeepers Association with the suggestion whereby we as a province would institute a certification process as it relates to the Varroa mite. We are examining that possibility, but I would not wish to leave any false impressions, because this is solely under the jurisdiction of the federal government as it relates to the closure of the border.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the minister indicate what the status of the Alberta Beekeepers Disaster Assistance Program is?
Mr. Speaker, I'm more than happy to share with honourable members that in consultation with our Beekeepers Association, we have implemented a $2.2 million program. It has two components. One is a $10 per hive payment, and the other is a $200,000 honey promotional aspect within this program. To date, I'm happy to share with honourable members that we have had 260 participants apply for the per hive payment.
Final supplementary question. Can the minister indicate how this program compares to other provinces in Canada?
Mr. Speaker, we are the only province in Canada that has offered support to our ailing honey industry.
Is one more supplementary available to Dunvegan? Vegadale, pass. Calgary Forest Line.
Mr. Speaker, the oil re-refining industry represents an opportunity to create valuable employment by producing high-quality oil from waste motor oil. Unfortunately, in spite of the oil drop program, only 20% of lubricating oil sold in Alberta is recycled, and both the turbo refining facility in Edmonton and the hub oil plant in my constituency face stiff competition from low-priced virgin oil. These companies are now faced with a new challenge, substantially increased costs. They either have to send their waste to the Swan Hills site or they add expensive new treatment facilities. To the Minister of the Environment, will the Minister admit that high disposal charges frustrate the purpose of the Swan Hills facility by forcing hazardous waste into ordinary landfills rather than having it trucked to Swan Hills?
No, Mr. Speaker.
Oh. Well, Mr. Speaker, given that Turbo won't complete its plants to neutralize its acid waste until June and that Hub faces the possibility of closure, leaving waste oil collectors awash with waste motor oil, will the Minister explain what alternatives these collectors will have other than pouring it down sewers and drains or spraying it on country roads?
None, Mr. Speaker, in Canada there are currently 3 oil refiners. There's one in the province of Ontario and 2 in the province of Alberta, one Hub Oil in Calgary and Turbo Oil in Edmonton. And in the last year, we've had ongoing discussions with both firms, and we are continuing discussions with Hub Oil.
Well, I didn't really answer my question, which had to do with where is all this waste oil going in the meantime? To the Minister of Public Works, Supply and Services, in the interest of firming demand for refined oil and ensuring the future of the refining industry in Alberta, will the Minister recommend to Cabinet that the government buy refined oil for its fleet of vehicles, as recommended by the Environmental Council of Alberta on page 22 of its report on recycling?
Hear, hear.
The Minister will take your representation under consideration.
Hope I get a better answer than that from the Minister of Federal and Intergovernmental Affairs. But to that Minister, since re-refined oil is taxed twice by the federal government, once as new oil and again as refined oil, will the Minister make representation to the federal government that only the additives in re-refined oil be taxed so that we can make re-refined more competitive and help clean up our environment at the same time?
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure that's a matter my colleague, the Provincial Treasurer, will keep in mind when he meets next with the Federal Minister of Finance. Vermilion Viking, is this supplementary now, Calgary Buffalo? Perhaps.
The Minister could tell us what he's going to do about the situation in which items such as telephone poles treated by chemicals and other items are no longer can be disposed of locally, yet the facilities at the Swan Hills are not able to.
Thank you, Honourable Member. Not germane to the original topic. Vermilion Viking.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To the Minister of Forestry, Lands and Wildlife. The Grazing Reserve Associations of Rannoch, Minburn, St. Paul, Smoky Lake and Wolf Lake pastures have indicated a severe water shortage this spring in both natural areas and dugouts, and they fear that the 9,000+ head of cattle may have to be removed or not admitted at all. What is the Department's assessment of this?
Time for question period has expired. Might we have unanimous consent to complete this issue? Opposed? Carried. Minister?
Yes, Mr. Speaker. We're certainly aware of the serious situation that's evident in that area right now. And the assessment at this point has been from basically the grazing reserve supervisors that file weekly reports with me, as well as the MLAs from Vermilion Viking and Redwater Andrew and St. Paul that have brought pictures and everything showing the low dugout water levels that are evident in the area. The assessment that we're doing now is to see what options are available and the cost of those options with respect to how effective they would be.
Supplementary then, if wells were to be used instead of, say, piping from the North Saskatchewan River or trucking, what numbers and costs are we likely to be talking about?
Mr. Speaker, I don't. We haven't rejected the option of piping at our first consideration of it. It looks like it's fairly costly, as well as the trucking may be a possibility in some isolated areas, but maybe not overall. The water problem itself is one that I'm working with the Minister of Agriculture and the Minister of the Environment, as well as the Minister of Transportation, to look at how we could put together a package that may be helpful. But in answer to the member's question, if we were to look at the wells that my department advises would likely be necessary to meet it at $10,000 a well, could come as high as $500,000.
Yes, Mr. Minister, recognizing the financial strain on the patrons due to the drought, has the minister considered not having mandatory veterinary inspection on each reserve in view of the fact that funding was removed by the Department of Agriculture this year?
Mr. Speaker, I think that's an excellent approach in that the Department of Agriculture did fund the veterinary services on the grazing reserves, and it was a mandatory requirement by my department that veterinary services be there to inspect all the cattle as they come in. I've now made the decision that to follow on the advice I've been given by MLAs that likely that mandatory requirement really isn't necessary, and that each grazing reserve would have to make their own decision with respect to veterinary services. Of course, it would be at their own cost, and they would have the right to reject cattle if they're suspect, and each grazing reserve manager and the patrons of that reserve would make that decision.
Supplementary information, Minister of Agriculture.
Supplement the excellent information that my honourable colleague has given to the honourable member for Vermilion Viking. Can I indicate to him that presently we do have a program, the farm pumping program, under our department that one could make available to individuals within the grazing reserves. We are presently, as the honourable member indicated, examining further aid towards those areas that are having difficulty as it relates to their water supply.
Final supplementary, Vermilion Viking. Westlock Sturgeon. No.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, supplementary to the Minister of Forestry, original Minister, but I'm not so positive they need some help here. In view of the fact that a great deal of our water is being used now, both out of wells and out of dams for commercial purposes, particularly the secondary flooding of oil reservoirs, and this could be postponed a bit. Has the Minister talked to with those other ministers involved with the idea of possibly suspending or cutting down the use of fresh water for industrial purposes wherever possible to get us over this drought area this summer?
Mr. Speaker, I haven't directly in my responsibilities in this portfolio, but the Minister of the Environment and the Minister of Agriculture may wish to respond.
Member for Vegreville.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Supplementary to the Minister, having had the opportunity yesterday to tour the Rannoch Community Pasture with 6 of the directors, I can attest firsthand to the very serious water shortage in the area, and I'm wondering if the Minister has a commitment from his Cabinet colleagues to commit the required amount of extra funding in the event that it's determined necessary to drill some wells on these community pastures.
Mr. Speaker, we'll, of course, look at all options that would be helpful in the area, but I can't make any commitment on what we would do until we know what the options really are. Each reserve may have to be dealt with on an individual basis rather than overall on all of the reserves, because each circumstance is a little bit different, but I must say that all of them certainly have a severe drought problem.
Time for question period.